My name is Dr. Jeanne Allert, and just by virtue of a brief introduction, I have been in the anti-trafficking field for going on 20 years. God has an interesting sense of humor, took an internet consultant and decided that I was going to go into ministry, but some of you have likewise probably had very interesting trajectories. And so I have been blessed to be in this field and largely schooled by survivors themselves. And I consider it such an honor that they would even take time with me and take what's called a square. That's what we are. If you're not in the life, you're a square. To take a square and put some rounded edges on that. So I have been working with survivors for that period of time. And one of the things that has been a challenge about being a Christian organization, we ran a residential program in the Baltimore, Washington area for about 13 years. And then we changed, made a big pivot and became the Institute for Shelter Care, which now is helping to raise up the next generation of shelter providers, and in particular those that are working with the exploited. We work with all shelters, regardless of their faith affiliation, but our keen interest is to building up the faith sector in this work. So that's what we do, and you can imagine that in a context like ours, not unlike yours, we're completely unregulated. You're a lot more regulated than we are. So we don't have the imposition necessarily of government on how we do what we do, but we definitely have the context of being in the same social structure where people, particularly now, with our nation being far less churched than it has been in generations past, to be suspect as a Christian in this work. What is it that you're doing that makes it Christian, right? What is it that you're doing behind closed doors that's that hocus pocus that we naturally don't trust, right? And so many of you have probably heard the statements or the accusations that we have, like, oh, you're just getting these people who are vulnerable at their worst possible moments and you're forcing Jesus on them. Anybody else get the sort of shoved down the throat nasty comment about religion? And you know, after a while of hearing that, I just got tired of hearing that statement and thought, you know what, I know we're not doing that within our organization, but I do wonder if that is a practice that is happening nationally. Are we across the landscape of care seeing any kind of what you would call sort of a malpractice of religion within these shelter organizations? Because we're not regulated. There really isn't anybody saying you're doing it right or you're doing it wrong. And we're kind of all making it up as we go. So that was the impetus to go into the study that I want to share with you today. And we walked in with these particular questions. Now, right now in the United States, there are 211 shelters that specialize in victims of trafficking and exploitation, specifically sex trafficking. Of those, 155 of them identify as Christian organizations, so it is the larger percentage of the landscape. So we wanted to find out through the faith-based expression of this work certain questions to see, are we in fact doing any harm? We wanted to know in the area of admissions, are faith-based shelters being honest right up front about what it means to be entering into a faith-based program? Is there the proverbial bait and switch happening? No, honey, you can come into our program, but we're not going to tell you what we're going to force you to do. And that was the concern that we had. So are we being upfront about our identity and laying out the expectations for the survivors? We used to say in our intake in the organization that I ran that we would say you don't have to be Christian to be in our program, but you cannot be combative to our faith. So if you're willing to come in and not fight us on it, you are more than welcome to be here. And we would just gain assent for that agreement, and that was sufficient for us. And we wanted to know, is it the survivor's choice to go into a faith-based program? Because the landscape of care has changed dramatically over the 20 years that I've been in it. When we first started, there were very few shelters and so fewer options. I remember talking to a law enforcement in Florida, and he said the only options we have in our state are faith-based agencies. So what do we do with the individual who doesn't want to go into that type of program? So we were wondering, just by virtue of availability of services, is there any kind of compulsion to them having to go into a faith-based program? We also wanted to know, when they are in that program, are they being forced religion in any kind of way? Are we taking advantage of this otherwise captive, and I use that with air quotes, population? And conversely, are they punished if they don't participate? You know, is there any kind of either overt or subtle hostility if you're kind of not getting on the Jesus bus? And so we wanted to find that out. We also wanted to know, in terms of outcome, is any of this working? Is any of this actually helping? I mean, we think it's important, but is it important to them? And quite frankly, at the end of the day, that's what really matters. And what might we learn from their experiences that might inform how we do the work we do and the way in which we express our faith? So I'm going to take you through the study, but I want to tell you, first of all, compliments. If you came to my last session yesterday, you came to probably one of the darkest sessions of the conference. This will be all light. And so you will end well with this one. So our study is, we did an online survey instrument during a very short period of time, largely because we have access to this population. So it was not hard for us to get to individuals to survey. And so we sent out an email to the existing faith-based shelters. And what we were asking for is voluntary participation from any of the residents who are currently in your program or any survivors who had been in your program prior with whom they still had contact. And some of our agencies have longitudinal contact with their survivors, some of them don't. So we left it wide open. We had a funder who gave us the funds necessary to remunerate the participants, and we got 158 survivor responses within this short period of time, which is at least statistically significant enough to base these assertions. But one of the things that was extremely important about the design of the study was we wanted anonymity of the survivor, largely because we didn't want the instrument itself to be anything that was a compulsion, right? If you got somebody standing over you and while you're answering, you know, a survey, there might be that sense of, I better answer it because right now my residency might depend on, right? I'm in your program. So we didn't want that to be an issue at all. And so we worked on layers of anonymity so that we would not know who the survivors were. We also didn't want to know what agency they came from, frankly, because I don't want to be in the cop role, right? I want to have to go back later and say, you're doing X, Y, or Z. And we also wanted to make sure that they felt that there was going to be no consequence to however they might answer. So we didn't ask some of the demographic information that you would normally ask in a survey on purpose. And then ultimately what we did when we got the data set was we stripped out anything that could be inferred as identifying before it went to the analyst to look at the data. There were a few write-in comments where somebody would volunteer something like the name of an agency or whatnot, and all of that was redacted. So let's get an idea of who the respondents were to this particular study. And so I mentioned we had 158 respondents, and you see that they sort of cluster into these age groups, with the largest age population being about 30 to 39. Now, it might be helpful for you to know that in terms of the shelters that participated in this study, the majority of shelters that are out there are serving adult survivors. We would see in our program, on average, our intake was around age 22, but you could have an intake as old as early 60s. And so it's a wide range for the exploited population. But it was very important for us to understand the age of the survivor, because if you followed any of the Barna group work about sort of Christianity in America, you have seen that we are definitely on a decline in terms of level of religiosity and biblical worldview within this nation. So part of the other overlay that I was keen to pay attention to is, what would they say about faith practices relative to their age? Because if they weren't, you know, I'm 60, so I grew up in a different America than somebody who's in their 30s. And I wanted to see how they would perceive faith practices as important or part of their upbringing. So that's the demographic we had in terms of age. We also wanted to know how long had they been in the program, because at least the hypothesis was, if you were brand new in the program, everything's new to you, right? Everything's foreign, whether it's a faith practice or, oh my gosh, I had to give up cigarettes. This is the worst place on the planet. which oddly enough is a big deal. So we saw that their average length of stay in a shelter was about a year, and that we saw that the largest percentage of our responses, they had been in the program in the early phases. So we had a large population, about a third, that were within that early phase, the first 6 months of being in a program. But because we had individuals who had left the program, they'd completed the program and then were answering, that's why we have average length of stay was 12 months. I think our longest was 3.5 years. Somebody had reported being in a program. Well, we wanted to understand, before we can ask about how you perceive these faith practices, what's your background in any kind of faith? If you're coming from 0 or are you coming from 90? We had no idea. And what we learned was that there was a pretty high percentage of folks who had had some exposure to faith growing up. You see that the largest percentage, even just a third though, was that the family regularly attended church, but then they fell away when they were younger. There is some their parents believing in God, or a quarter of the time they had a bad experience with somebody who was a religious person, and then that turned them away from faith. And so really a rather small percentage that came from absolute 0, that had no exposure to faith growing up. So you'll recall that the first question was, we wanted to know, was the entrance into the faith-based program, was that a barrier at all? Was the invitation mat, the welcome mat laid out well? So we asked them, what made you choose to enter into a faith-based program? And we were surprised by the results, that close to 50% said, I chose to go into a faith-based program because I wanted to reconnect with my faith. That has been such an encouragement to us, because we've never asked before whether or not there was actually a hunger for what we had to offer. It's just who we were. And we saw that 28% said, I'm not, but I want to become a person of faith. So look at the high percent. 75% said that they purposely chose to go into a faith-based program for that reason. Now, we do have some occasions where the program was chosen by somebody else. That could be a case manager, that could be the court, that could be a social worker, et cetera. That does happen. I thought this one was interesting. Faith-based programs were better. We did a little dance in the back room when we saw that one. But you see they have other options here, like this was the only one that accepted me, this was the only one that's available, because out of only 211 in the United States, we have 7 states that have no shelter program at all and 8 states that have only 1. And so for individuals like that, their options are very limited. And so we have seen that survivors move a lot in terms of their care and where they can get the services that they need. Now, what I put up are some of the comments that they offered, and one of the things I found most endearing about doing this research was, you know how sometimes when you do surveys, people are like, how quickly can I get through pressing all the buttons? Not so in this. They took their time, clearly, because we made sure that for every single question we asked, we left a very open-ended comments field so they could tell us anything they wanted, and they wrote volumes on almost every single question. So look at this one, for example. Nothing else worked. I'd gone to 7 different programs that were not faith-based. Nothing helped in me finding freedom from addiction and a myriad of other things that perpetuated this addiction. I'd wasted so much time finding what I was in search of that I needed a new approach. And at my level of broken, I finally surrendered that maybe God was the missing piece. We wanted to know whether or not when they were in the program, was there anything that was forced upon them? And we asked them, did anything that was being offered in that program make you feel uncomfortable? And you see that disproportionately, nothing that we offered made them feel uncomfortable. Now, I will say this as an editorial comment, I have found survivors of exploitation to be some of the hardiest people I've ever met in my life. And they have a phenomenal capacity for what is uncomfortable to the rest of us. If you've slept in a stairwell, if you've been in and out of some of the chaos and trauma that they have, their capacity to deal with uncomfortable is, in my opinion, unparalleled. And so I think that didn't catch me as much by surprise, but it still is rewarding to see. We asked, was what did the shelter do if you did express that you didn't want to participate? If somebody said, I don't want to go to church, or don't make me pray, or what is that fasting thing, or any of those kinds of things, we wanted to know, are they meeting the letter of the law? Because legally, even as a faith-based organization, you can't compel the acts. You have to make either a reasonable accommodation or you have to excuse the individual from that particular activity. And so that's meeting the letter of the law, and you see that we have about 50% said there's an alternate activity, and then 43% said they could be excused. Now, what was interesting about the I would have to do it anyway, and here again I'll editorialize having done residential care, is that oftentimes we would have a perception where the individual felt as though it was a compelled act, but it wasn't the faith practice that was compelled. It might be other situational factors, and I'll give you a good illustration. So in our program, we had a capacity of about 14 beds, and we went to church every Sunday. And so everybody on Sunday, get in the van, we're going to church, right? That's what we do, that's in the program, you knew that coming in. And the compulsion was, you have to go with us, because we didn't have staff who were going to stay home. We couldn't accommodate that financially. And so the compulsion was you had to stay under supervision. But once we got to the church, if you wanted to sit out in the lobby with a volunteer, that was totally fine. You did not have to participate in the religious portion of the activity, but our responsibility was to maintain supervision. But you can see how somebody still might see that as, you making me go. And if any of you have teenagers, it still comes across as, you're making me go, right? So I'm not discounting it, but by illustration, you can see that. And also when we have 0 to 6 months, that they may still feel as though some of these activities are being forced upon them. And then this probably most pivotally, have you ever had anybody pressure you to engage in a faith practice? 91% said no, nobody has ever pressured me. And that for us was a huge win in terms of feedback, because we were concerned that even in a relational way you can feel pressure. You know how sometimes can somebody be like, okay, but we're going without you, and that still can be perceived as pressure? They said no, they did not feel as though that they were being pressured to engage. So when I talk about faith practices, what am I saying is actually going on within these settings that we were pulling out? And so we asked them, what are the faith practices that exist within the shelter program within you currently reside, or that you had previously attended? And you see really, these were all that were 50% or more. And so there's a lot of commonality to what is done in these shelters. We've actually done this study of what are the faith practices. We've been doing that since 2017. And these are incredibly common. What has really risen, though, is listening to Christian music. We've realized how much individuals with trauma respond very favorably to music, and so there's been more music incorporated, as well as journaling. But some of these others, I think it'll be interesting as we see a few of them, like the praying out loud, as we go forward. So then we asked the really risky question, sort of like, what did you think about Christians before you came into this program, and how do you like me now? And we, just as a quick summary, these are some of their comments. We just wanted to get a flavor, and it would not surprise you that the most common term that was used for how you perceived Christians before coming into the program was the word judgmental. It's almost trite at this point because everybody sort of defaults to that. But I really like it when they say something like, they crazy judgmental, they weird and all good looking on the outside and all. And I'm like, yeah. Probably, probably true. Hypocrites, they judge you, they stare at you when you go to church. That's an interesting perception. I thought they were really boring, judgmental, and maybe a little nuts. Hey, they gave us honest feedback, right? That they were perfect, and if I wasn't perfect, I was going to hell. That they didn't accept people coming out of the background that I came from. So that's their perception going in. And I think that there's a lot that we take to heart with these results, because then we can hold those comments and we can say, check myself. Am I in church staring at somebody and making somebody feel uncomfortable? Am I, weird and good looking? Maybe. You know, these types of things where we can kind of check ourselves. But how they perceived Christians after having been in a program, either completing it or how they feel about it now, I know that everybody has some issues, but there are some truly amazing Christians out there that inspire me. I was misguided. I hated myself. I couldn't see the true love of God. My impression of Christians have changed. Yes, it's changed to some extent. They're all sinners, and each one has their own version of messy. We're all imperfect. Now think about how helpful that is for social reentry to realize what I've figured out about Christians is you're not so distant from me. Probably my favorite comment, I think it's in here somewhere, but it says, what I most like about Christians now is they mess up and they do S2, but they at least apologize. And I was like, hey, if that's the way you see us now, that's a pretty good reputation. So out of the faith practices, we wanted to say, well, what's been helpful to you? What has encouraged you or contributed to your relational dynamics, your mental well-being, your spiritual well-being? And astoundingly, Bible study was ranked as number one. 77% said Bible study has been a therapeutic gain for me. Can we all just yay to the Word of God, right? And I'll tell you, there have been times we had to learn an awful lot about how to do Bible study well. For example, you know, we're not whipping out King James on day one, right? We had great success getting the storybook Bible, and not as a patronizing way, but to realize if this is an individual who did not come up going to Sunday school, maybe we need to start at Sunday school. I will tell you some of the things that were the most powerful in the agency where I worked was the book of Hosea was a slam dunk. When a survivor would come up to me and she would say something like, Miss Jeanne, are there really hoes in the Bible? And I'm like, well, yes, we don't call them that, but, yeah. But yes, let's go see. And you know, that's when there's an invitation. That's when she's open to seeing. And then there's so many iterations of the Hosea and Gomer story to go through. And then of course, redeeming love, that one, you know. So it was a great way of creating this entry. But I think the other thing that we will see later, and I'll predispose you to it, is how much the characters in Scripture are so jacked up. They are a hot mess. Just take the apostles. They're all a hot mess. And it's great for somebody who thinks, but I'm a hot mess, right? And to be able to make the invitation through, yeah, but you know what? Even though Paul did all this bad stuff, right? God used him in this way. I will tell you, the single scripture that has the most impact with our survivors, probably the most quoted, if not tattooed, is for I know the plans I have for you, right? The Isaiah scripture. They love that because knowing that there's purpose to my chaos, that God can do something out of my mess, was incredibly healing for survivors. And so even though it may have felt like we were forcing you to go to church, you said that was really beneficial to you. Or maybe you didn't like having to get up in the morning and sit around with scripture and read Jesus Calling every single day, right? But those devotions ended up being something that were incredibly valuable. Why I've got to put down my rap music and now I got to start listening to Chris, Tomlin. And it's like, well, he's okay, but I like Lecrae better. Okay, that's fine, right? That's fine. But what I thought was so interesting was there were comments when we asked, were there any practices that you found at all distressing or difficult in the beginning? One of them was praying out loud. And I gotta tell you, coming up from being a Presbyterian to now hanging out with lots of evangelicals, I'm like, good night, y'all. And now I'm Baptist, and so they pray out loud for an awfully long time, right? And the Presbyterians, not so much. So even for Christians, that can be a difference. That can be a change. So you go to somebody who's not used to doing this. Any of you come out of Catholicism, you're like, I only read the ones that are written down. Like, we don't just freebase that thing, right? It's freaky if you're not used to it. But here's what we learned about that, is that while that's initially uncomfortable, the feedback was, oftentimes somebody in that circle of prayer was saying the very thing that was on my heart that I couldn't say. Somebody in that circle is saying, I really need to forgive my mother, or I really need to work on this. And I'm thinking that, but I didn't know I could say that out loud, because so much with trafficking survivors are in the realm of the unspeakable, that when we put it into the spoken, it takes away its power. And so it's not surprising for us to see that therapeutically what value something like praying out loud would have. So we also asked them other things about what has positively contributed to your spiritual growth while you've been in the program. And look at how interesting that the number one comment that we got about the preconceived idea about Christians, the inverse was actually true: felt not judged by the very people that I thought were the most judgmental. And how powerful that is for us to be so intentional about accepting people where they are, to be around people who are positive, to be around people who speak the truth, to learn about Jesus, to feel welcome. You see how so much of this is social, so much of this is interpersonal, to be accepted for the mess that I am. So we asked them what was the hardest part about being in a faith-based program. And I will say this was all write-in comments, and it took a while to kind of cull through all of the feedback. The majority of comments were things that they had to give up that were material things. Have to give up my cell phone, had to give up cigarettes, had to give up weed, had to give up my boyfriend, had to get whatever, right? All the things that are restrictions in these kinds of programs, had to give up cussing. I know it's hard, but having to give up the things that I was used to pouring into my life. But what we've noticed is when you have to give something up, you make space for something new. And so we have seen great value in saying, yes, maybe if we put down that music that is incredibly degrading to women, and you start listening to music that is edifying to you as a person, that can be have great value to you. But initially, it's hard. It's hard if everything's faith-based, right? Sometimes they just wanted to be normal. Like, I wasn't ready to go ahead and be Jesus Revolution, right? I'm not ready to go that far. Maybe I just want to know, how do I behave like a normal woman in society? And some of our women really struggle with that. Sometimes I just do what I don't want to do and I want to rebel. Goodness, who does that sound like? Sometimes I do what I don't want to do and I don't do the things that I should do. And so you take that and you're like, brilliant. Have you met Paul? Right? I need a safe and constructive place to express my anger. And this is something that I would say as a field, we need to get better at doing, because we serve primarily women in the field. It's about 3% will be male. But we need to make better and healthy outlets for the expression of anger. And we as Christians need to have a tremendous appetite for how much anger they have kept with them for such a long time. And maybe I need to really let it go with my anger from the uncle who molested me when I was 3 and I'm 30 and I'm still carrying that baggage along with me. And so I think that's instructive for us as well. What's another hard part about being in a program? Not knowing if I fully believe. Well, think of how easy that is for all of us to enter into that statement and talk about times when we've felt as though our faith was questionable or on shaky ground. Or the tragedy of saying the hardest part is, what if I let God down? Got to tell you, that one breaks my heart. And the hardest part is actually the healing. And think of how much that is something you all can speak into, because you often have to say in a physiological way that this treatment might hurt before it gets better. And we have to say that therapeutically, that this treatment might hurt before it gets better. Letting go of something before you can have the new, or ripping that off before this is going to heal, absolutely consistent in our world. We asked him, what have we missed? What aren't we doing that maybe you would like to have? What are the other faith practices? This one kind of broke my heart. Maybe help my family come to know God. I've come to know God, but what about my family? What about the fact that I grew up in a household where everybody's criminal and everybody's doing drugs? And I don't know how I'm going to go back to that family after having had the cool glass of water, right? Now, how do I go back to that and still have my family? Can you help them too? Breaks my heart. Just let me do it in my own time. And I will say that is something that we have to, in my industry, we have to be careful of, because we are so mindful of the fact that we have survivors with us for such a short period of time that I think sometimes there is a overzealousness, and which is why you see comments like, it can't be Jesus all the time. Sometimes we just need to do normal for a while. We have made some inroads in terms of Bible study, as I've illustrated, in more interactive ways, slowed down. One of the other conditions of faith practices that people said in the beginning were uncomfortable or distressing was deliverance. About 9% in the study said that's uncomfortable, that's distressing. And I would say, again, coming out of Presbyterian, yeah. Because if you don't understand it, it does look like hocus pocus, which is what our ladies used to call it, hocus pocus. And so, but if you do understand it, right, and if it is something that you can convey, then maybe tell us more about how that works. Because some of our women misunderstand that it's a magic trick that's going to make you better. And we have to do a better job of explaining some of the things. But then we have comments like, I think the program was actually perfect. It kept me on my toes for sure, but it also gave me time to heal and to grow. It was important to constantly stay busy when taking time to connect spiritually with God and to congregate with other people in order to grow. So here's part of what we learned from the overall study. And so this is just a quick rattle off of some of the statistics, and then I would just open it up for any questions that you might have, is that we saw that about 81% of our population grew up with some exposure to faith, but fell away. We can already talk about that as how that is sort of common in Christendom. We saw that 75% of them intentionally chose to go into a program either because they wanted to reconnect with their faith or they wanted to become a person of faith. They didn't feel as though they were being pressured. And as I mentioned, it was 11%, that said only deliverance was reported as something that was distressing, and maybe we could do a better job of communicating that. 90% of agencies offered those reasonable accommodations, so we are following the letter of the law. And we saw that about, in analyzing their writing comments, we found that individuals reported that the hardest part about being in the program was learning how to walk out the journey of the Christian faith. And how accessible is that for all of us to say, yes, we can all talk about how difficult it can be to walk out the faith. And then we asked them about what their faith conviction is now. And this sample, 84% of them said that they now identify as Christian. And perhaps one of the most endearing comments to come out of that was repeatedly I saw in their narrative that I finally feel like I belong somewhere. I finally feel like I am a part of this group that I never really understood. I'm now a daughter of the King. I'm not fill in the blank, right? And those kinds of incredibly heartwarming statements that are the good news that come out of this. So I've talked a little bit about the things that we've taken away from this, that in the shelter community, what's been important for us. And we have to, for one thing, stop being so apologetic about who we are. I will say that my field has a tendency to sort of cower behind, like, say the faith part's quieter, right? And emphasize being clinical or something else as if that is more important when we know, in fact, that is not what advances entirely the healing, that it is Jesus that affects the healing. That we are following the law, and so we, again, not only don't have to be apologetic about that, there might be areas where we do have to shore up in that 15% that are perhaps not erring on the side of choice or reasonable accommodations. And so I think that that's something where we're just constantly having scrutiny. But the fact that so many of their comments, as I mentioned, this was disproportionately a wordy data set, that they were talking a lot about relationships and indicated that they had come to see Christians in a new light and that that was bolstering their faith journey. That having somebody who walked alongside them was critical, that they couldn't have done this on their own, and they needed to be in a community where they were going to be supported in those tender sort of new sprout manifestations of their faith. But that also we in the shelter community need to continue to build out options for a diversity of learning styles and paces and coming from different faith backgrounds so that the invitation is even wider. But I would say that there are implications for this study, even though this is within the confines of the shelter community, but for Christian providers in general, we walked out of this study saying if we need to do anything at all, it's double down. It's stop being so timid. And I will editorialize, because I can't help myself, and say, up against the society in which we live right now, where truth is such a relative concept, that it is so fragile, if not confused, that we need to go even harder onto what is truth, capital T, because we find in our sector that the clients are absolutely hunger for truth, for spiritual connection, to know black is black and white is white, and what does God say about me? Because the world has said so many other things about me that I need an authority to tell me who I really am so that I can walk into that identity. And that clients may be hesitant at first with the faith practices that we have. Maybe just because the practices are foreign. Maybe it's just like, why are you all praying out loud? Or I don't understand that. And that's okay. We have to stay the course. We ought not to recoil and say, well, just because somebody's in distress. And I think that's why it's so great to talk to people like you, because well, I know this is uncomfortable, but I've still got to do it. And so many of your things that you have to do, like the little, right, like the thing or the needle and all the things that you have to do, that we're like, this is going to hurt, but, right? You have that advantage. We don't have that advantage. I wish we had more of this. This is going to hurt, but it is for your good. And making it voluntary certainly makes it invitational. And I think because one of the things that we learned over and over again was that survivors did perceive that participating in these faith practices were ultimately their choice, and that made it a more attractive invitation rather than the compulsion. And that we just are reinforced by the fact that ultimately, as the adage goes, you might be the only Bible they ever read, that we are the embodiment of the faith, and we have to understand with conviction that every encounter they have with us is in some way saying, what does it mean to be a person of the Christian faith? And so they will evaluate what is true against us. And we hope that the results continue to be, I thought one thing, but my relationship with you proved that it wasn't true. And in fact, it was so not true that now I want to be like you, and I want to be in the kingdom with you. I do think that this study leads to implications for further research. We would like to do more study on specific interventions that are helpful to trauma recovery. I already mentioned to you that we've already seen over the last 20 years, music is something that we need to integrate more. Journaling seems to be something we need to integrate more. Giving voice is something that we say in trauma-informed care, but I believe, editorializing, but I have empirical evidence for this, that when we say giving voice, we always default to that being auditory. And I think we're missing the mark on that, because giving voice to somebody might be letting her write, let her sing, let her draw, let her paint, let her do theater, let her do all of those types of things that give voice in other forms of expression. And I'm hoping that our field expands that trauma-informed care principle, that voice takes a lot of different forms. And then I do believe that this study and others need to explore more cultural and demographic differences, not only the demographic differences of age, because we continue to see that decline, as I've mentioned, in religiosity in our society, And what is it going to be for the survivor who today is 14 and grew up where it's not 15% who've had no exposure to faith, but it's 78% who say, I have no idea what you're talking about. So that'll become very different for us. And there is some research to suggest in certain communities, for example, there's probably 4 studies that I have found that in African American communities, religiosity is much more important, and the way it's expressed is much clearer than the wide diversity that we have across the denominational sphere. So I think these are important things for us to continue to intelligently mine. And I will say that I think that we as Christians have got to stay within the legislative, cultural, political sphere, because faith-based organizations are continually under attack. And we face religious liberty issues all the time. We have a team of attorneys who just work with shelters who are being challenged, I won't say persecuted yet, but challenged for the ways in which they are allowing these faith practices to happen within their organizations, and regulatory bodies who are trying to sort of squeeze that out. So we can't have 77% saying, this is my choice, this is what I want, this is the kind of care that is important to me, and then have our regulatory forces say you can't have it. And so it is important for us to stay engaged in these spheres so that we can continue to give survivors what they most need. So that is the quick blast through the study, but you all are so fortunate because I brought several copies of the report, and our lovely room assistants will hand those out. I hope that you will read it. It truly is good news. I hope that you will pore over the comments that survivors had, because some of them are completely endearing and heartwarming. We know this is good news, but it is great to hear it expressed from this population. All right, have a great afternoon.